Welcome into another edition of the Sharps Report here on BettingPros.com. My name is Matt Perrault. We've been off for a little while. We're back after a couple of weeks. I apologize. I had some personal things I had to take care of before we get back rolling here. But we are really happy to be joined this week on the Sharps Report with a guy who I think has more jobs than me, which is pretty impressive because I have a bunch of jobs. But he is Edward Egros from TVG, from FanDuel, from everywhere else. He's joining us on this week's Sharps Report. Edward, Matt Perrault, how are you, bud?
Doing well. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for your time. So let's start right there. Your schedule and what you do. I mean, my goodness gracious, how many jobs do you actually have right now?
And it vacillates too from like week to week where something can pop up randomly. And so let's say I can count on two hands, or it requires a second hand rather, at any given moment. But you know what? These things change. They're fluid. Yeah. And so you just have to be ready for those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even I have to remind myself what the schedule is. Sure.
Right. How do you balance your time?
How do I balance my time? It's one of those things where sometimes you have to remind yourself that when you're scheduling, various commitments, that you do need to take a little bit of downtime, whether it's over the weekend or things like that. I had a friend ask me the other day, like, "Oh, I'm sure weekends are nuts for you." And I go, "Well, some weekends are actually pretty calm when it comes to preparing for football or major basketball games or, any major postseason baseball series, whatever it might be." It's one of those things where you have to make sure that you schedule at least a little bit of downtime, whether it's meeting up with friends or whatever it is, that you're not always working all the time. That, yeah, there may be another opportunity to take on another project and make a couple more bucks, but it may not be in your best interest because then maybe you can't give them 100% of your effort. You have to make sure that whether you're sports betting all the time or you have a number of jobs because you're part of the gig economy, that you remind yourself that the personal life and just rest, those things matter a lot, because you want to make sure that when someone does give you some hard-earned bucks to work for something, that you're able to contribute as best you can. And if you are stretched too thin, you're unable to do that.
Let's come back to that here, because that's a great point, and I want to pick up on just the psychology and the time management of being a gambler and what we all have to do to kind of get through a college or pro football season. But How did you get into this? Let's kind of go to the start. How did you find your way into the sports gambling world? And then how did you find your way onto television?
Yeah, so television was the first thing that occurred. So back when I was an undergrad student at SMU over in Dallas, I double majored in journalism and economics, and I looked at specifically statistical economics. And at the time, I had no idea that the two things would come together. In fact, I think it was one of those things where I said, okay, journalism is the risky play here. Let me do something that's risk averse and go into economics. I enjoy that, and I enjoy stats, and I enjoy looking at markets and sort of figuring out, okay, what goes up, what goes down, how do you identify wages, put together an equation for that, those kinds of things. I also worked for Daimler Chrysler for a little bit, predicting how used cars would fare at auction. And that was a blast in terms of, getting my feet wet as far as the modeling aspect of it, way before like open source and, how in vogue it is now. But what was interesting was that as I was in local television, bouncing around from market to market, I started to see all these statistical economic concepts, econometrics, getting used in sports. And obviously Moneyball was the first big thing, but then I saw it in basketball with Ken Pom, and I saw it in baseball a good bit in other areas. And then Football Outsiders became more of a thing, and that started to grow. And I saw all these avenues, and I saw sort of the methodologies that were being used. And I'm like, wait a minute, I know this stuff. I know what they're doing. Yeah, I'm a little rusty at it, but it's not a foreign language to me. So I thought, you know what? How about I start to include these things into my broadcasting career? Because I think if you're a broadcaster, a journalist, whatever, you're always trying to find some way to stand out, some way to be yourself. And you're not trying to, I think the good ones at least aren't trying to be a copycat as far as looking at someone else they enjoy and say, you know what, I want to be just like them when I grow up. The best ones may take elements of that, but ultimately they want to be themselves and be their own pioneer, so to speak. So I saw all of this great econometric study being used, and I thought, you know what, I can use these things in a broadcast element because no one's really doing that. So got my master's at Northwestern in predictive analytics, went to Dallas to work for Fox 4 there for about 5 years as the weekend sports anchor, had a blast doing it. But I also saw that there were real limitations in local television as far as using these tools. And it was a tough decision to make, but ultimately I said, I need to find a bigger space and something that's a little bit more receptive to include these tools. And then sports betting just kind of fell into my lap with FanDuel. They offered me an opportunity to be on their weekly show. And I said yes, because I figured, you know what, I can use these tools in the sports betting space. And then from there, it became quite addictive because it was something where you're basically dealing with numbers and saying, okay, the market says 3. What does your number say when you put together a model? And I might say, okay, it's at 2 or 4.5 or something. Oh my goodness, this is a 2.5 point spread or 2.5 point difference. Let me go ahead and really stress the importance of this. And so it was an opportunity to use my broadcasting skills that I had been using over the years. It was an opportunity to talk about data and also apply these things to explaining what matters when it comes to particular games and sports. It's infuriating whenever you have a beat reporter or something like that stress the importance of, say, like a running back in football and say, okay, well, so and so is going to be out, so that's going to be a big hit. And I'm looking at my data saying, no, it's not. It's not going to be that big of a deal. And so to have those platforms to be able to say those things without conventional wisdom drowning me or trying to make me look like an idiot, that was really exciting as well. And so it was the combination of the broadcast sports betting landscape and then just my overall inclinations that got me here.
It's interesting because I've talked to some people about this, just about how the sports gambling media, in particular video, where we're going and what is happening, because we want to be broadcast, right? Not narrowcast. We want to be as open as possible. So how have you, and what have you found is receptive, or at least does the audience respond well to certain types of analytical conversations, or does some of the conversations just go over their head and they don't fully understand what's going on?
It's a really good question, because I try and strike that balance myself whenever there is a new statistic out there. So one example would be Ben Baldwin's work. His website, rbsdm.com, has been a great resource for me as far as finding new up-to-date EPA data in football. And one of his new contraptions, it's not new, it's been around for a couple of years now, but it's EPA CPOE composite, which is a great way to evaluate quarterback success up to this point. And I know when I talk about it on More Ways to Win, I cite it a lot, but it's also something where I only have like 10 to 20 seconds to spit out my point. And so how do I explain what this metric is for someone who doesn't know it, while also being able to cut to the chase and get my point and get it done so that everyone has time to speak and we're not going over, so to speak. Right. And that's a real tough balance. And it's something that I still try and figure out when it comes to how to be more advanced and how to advance the conversation so that we all become smarter bettors, while also understanding that broadcast has limitations.
Does it, as the audience gets more informed, like I remember when people first started using DVOA, right? Mm-hmm. And now I think when you say offensive or defensive DVOA, people might not know exactly what the formula is that goes into that, but they know that if you're high in the DVOA chart, that's a good thing. And so you say, well, they're really low in DVOA or high in DVOA. People, they tend to, it's kind of like WAR with baseball. You started to go, oh, what's the WAR? And, Mike Trout's incredible with WARs. People kind of started to figure out exactly what that metric is. Does it make it easier when the metrics, when that terminology becomes sort of a household name? And then how difficult is it when you're citing something that's brand new and you only have those 10 to 15 seconds? Do you just kind of cite it, or do you want to explain it more?
And that's a really good point you're making, because even within WAR, you have Fangraphs WAR and Baseball Reference WAR, and then Baseball Prospectus has things. So it's one of those things where you have to continue to advance the conversation. And sometimes that's as simple as repetition. It's something we actually see in the political world, where if one particular politician or side wants to drive home a point, what do? They don't necessarily explain it every time. They just say it over and over and over again to where another person follows it. And then a few more people follow it, to eventually an entire community follows it. And then a state follows it. And there is something useful in that dynamic, regardless of whatever content is being spewed. But if you say it enough times, eventually someone is going to catch on and say, hey, they're talking about it enough times. This bet turned out to be right, or these few bets turned out to be right. What is this? I want to learn more about it. And I think that's the way to go. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I am I very much champion is, as much as we complain about social media, there is a usefulness to the platform. And one thing that you can do is, if you're citing something over and over again, send a tweet, post something on Facebook about it and say, hey, I know I talk about this metric a lot. Here's where you can find it, or here's where you can find more information about it. I think when you do that enough times and someone starts to follow the brand, whether it's the Matt Perrault brand or the Edward Egros brand, it's one of those things where you cite something enough times, eventually enough people want to learn more about it because they're seeing the success. And they're also noticing the limitations of previously used statistics. It's one of those things where you can't constantly use yards to determine who are the most successful quarterbacks in college or the NFL. You have to do something better. And we all get to that point differently as far as that epiphany. But once you're there, then you have the appetite for finding something else. And that's when you can sort of clamp down and find those opportunities.
I love that. Look, baseball has been using stats for eons. It's what the whole sport is based on it, right? But what happens when in football too? For this, now we're getting into kind of a more of a analytical angle for football. But what do you make of sports like basketball and hockey, which were they're not as used to being looked at from an analytical or from a metric standpoint? How have you found, what's the differences with different sports when it comes to the availability of the metrics or what you can do yourself from a modeling perspective?
There's a category of statistics that I think matters a good bit when it comes to the type of data you're dealing with and how robust and reliable the data can be. So when it comes to football and baseball, next-gen stats are widely available, and those things are useful. So, for example, how do you determine the value of a running back in football? Because the offensive line matters a good bit, and when you call running plays, how many defenders are in the box, all that stuff tends to matter a good bit more than, say, the overall value of a specific running back. But you watch the game, clearly Derrick Henry's really good at what he does with his stiff arms and his power, things like that. Nick Chubb's obviously good at what he does. So then you can use next-gen stats to say, okay, rushing yards over expected, which is analytically driven, can help us determine who the best running backs are. And it's a great metric, and I cite it all the time, and that's great. Baseball also has StatCast data in terms of exit velo and launch angle and barrel percentage and who is in a slump, but they're going to come out of it soon in terms of looking at WOBA versus expected WOBA. So those two sports in particular have measurable physical data that can help us determine who really is successful and who will be successful in the future. Basketball and hockey, not that they don't have those things currently, but they're not widely available. And as far as I can tell, aren't publicly available. Basketball will measure speed and shot angles and things like that, but it's not something where you can go to stats.nba.com and have those things ready to go. Now, what they do have are things like pick and roll percentage and that stuff, ISO percentage, and that is useful. That can be helpful. And then you look at which defenses struggle in these situations, and then you can put something together. Hockey has perhaps even less of those things, but I also know that they have measurables that at some point will be publicly available, and when they are, I want to be the first to pounce on it.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. Yeah. Because for hockey, there's a lot like expected goals, high danger chances. Like I just feel like hockey is beginning to become more of that, where you can start to look at these stats and they're tracking these stats more and they're becoming more widely available. And because I really do think that hockey betting has a monster opportunity now that ESPN's back on board and they're putting all the games on ESPN Plus. So essentially, if you're paying for ESPN Plus, you get like an NHL ice package essentially on your phone or on your app. And I think betting on hockey is going to really take off. So I've been trying to educate my audience a little bit on that as to, okay, these are important stats to look at in important situations where maybe it's been like it's a 2-1 game, but the team you bet on, it's a loss, but they should have won the game just based upon the high danger chances or the saves above expected and where these goaltenders are. Do you think we're going to see more analytical available data and stats in sports like hockey to come?
Absolutely, because there's a market for it, and every sport wants to grow in some way, shape, or form. And it's funny because yesterday I was kind of reminded of this when I was having a debate on Twitter with a true friend of mine, a real friend, but he is very much antiquated as far as his views on football. And it reminded me that there are going to be some people who have conventional wisdom and they're going to stand by it as long as they're following sports, and that's fine. But I also understand that when it comes to sports and in some places declining popularity or trying to find a new generation or just understanding that sports bettors are always craving that edge wherever they can find it. I mean, give sports bettors credit here. They, for the most part, the ones who do it a long time and are at least somewhat good at it, they understand that there are new frontiers, that you're always trying to find an edge, that there's always new bits of information that no one quite can capture as far as what the market is concerned. And because you always have that craving to find something new, you are going to be more curious and find new data opportunities. And I think leagues want to provide that because now we're in an era where they want you to bet. And so it's a nice back and forth and a nice relationship that can be established. And those who embrace conventional wisdom, well, they're following the sports they want or not want. And you're not really going to convince them to go after new data, new ideas, things like that.
When somebody comes to you, or if somebody were to come to you and say, okay, I'm brand new, I think it's really interesting how you can find edges. I've always wagered or bet on my eyes, or I bet on my favorite team, and I'm not winning because I'm betting with my heart and not my head. How would you recommend somebody who wants to get started in the world of analytics? Where should they start?
So the first thing you need to do is have your data resources and figure out, okay, where do I want to go to find, if it's not the best, something that I can at least understand. The reference websites are outstanding. Pro Football Reference, Baseball Reference, all of those things. You can download the data, put it into a spreadsheet, put it into R, things like that, and that's super easy and you're good there. Second thing I would recommend, and this part may not be the fun part, but you do need to learn at least a little bit of light coding. And even if you are a firm believer in Excel, and a lot of people, in the analytical space look down upon Excel, and I understand why. But if you just need to get in and figure something out, then fine, use it, whatever. Put the data into a spreadsheet, actually look at it, crunch a couple of numbers, learn how to create a regression that you can do, just a couple of little data analysis steps in Excel, and at least get comfortable with actually what the process is and what exactly you're looking at in terms of determining who wins a game, who scores goals, whatever it is. And once you get used to that process, then you know where the next steps are, finding better data, more robust models, those kinds of things. I think you need data and you need just a little bit of coding to feel comfortable, because at the end of the day, what are we doing? We're finding numbers. We want to figure out what this spread is or what this total is, and then what you come up with, and then determine why there's a difference. And if it's unexplainable, then maybe you need to be pouncing on it. Or if you understand and it's a bad methodology where the market is, then go after it. So and obviously, like, keeping up with these sports and reading a lot helps, and watching the games, I think, is useful in terms of, sort of the personal peripheral stuff. But ultimately, it's data, it's coding, it's watching and keeping up with these things. And once you do that, then I think it becomes obvious where improvements can be made from any one of those areas.
And then what do you tell somebody who gets sucked into narratives? Because what you're doing and how you're analyzing data, there are no real narratives, right? You don't care about Tom Brady going back to the Patriots. You care about the Patriots' third down defense and care about the offensive line and how well they're protecting Tom Brady. The whole media created storyline doesn't matter. What's your recommendation for people who get sucked in by the media?
It's something interesting because I had to play that game for a while in local television in terms of hyping up these narratives. And I think what I noticed when I was doing that was that sometimes there would be a narrative that I actually did think would have a little bit of value. So college football would be a good instance here. So when Alabama lost to Texas A&M, what did you think Alabama was going to do against Mississippi State the following week? If you looked at your data and your numbers, you may be slightly off from that line and go after Mississippi State, knowing full well that Alabama just had a wake-up call And Nick Saban is a firm believer in, sort of pseudo punishment. And I use that word lightly. I mean, I don't mean it literally, but it's one of those things where you knew that this team would be far more motivated and realize, okay, we need to step this up, make our offensive game plans a little bit more complex, try and move the ball down the field with chunk plays a good bit more than we have. And then there's also turnover luck that you should also factor in, those kinds of things. But ultimately, I think you knew that Alabama would come out, much more motivated, knowing full well that they can't make another mistake if they're going to go after the national championship, which, they tend to a good bit. So I think those kinds of things matter. But then you have, is someone nervous? Like, is Tom Brady going to be nervous going back to Foxborough? No, he's not going to be nervous. He's going to compartmentalize, put it behind him because he's a professional. And there are a lot of professionals in professional football. And you have to accept that. And those are the kind of narratives that get annoying for me, because to the fans, it may matter a lot to them, but to the players and coaches, it may not. And there is a disconnect that you have to recognize. And if you don't, you are going to get burned from a betting landscape.
It's really interesting. And I think a lot of people who, make cases like, well, someone's due, right? Mm-hmm. As a numbers guy, how annoying is it when you hear somebody say somebody's due?
Well, sometimes you are. If you look at, say, your StatCast data from baseball, for instance, you may have a well below, or your ex-WOBA, for instance, may be a good bit higher than your actual WOBA. So let's say your exit velocity is really good, your launch angle is really good, but they're not falling for hits, or defenders always there, ready to catch a line drive. That is obnoxious, but I think that is a good example where, you probably are due at some point to rebound, and that's fine. But this notion where, if you notice sort of the plexiglass principle, where if someone had a really good season and then they fall off, oh, well, then they're going to be due again. Well, maybe that one season was an anomaly. And if you have basic statistics, then you don't really have an argument for who's due. So here is a basic narrative that actually can be supported, but you need advanced data to be able to do it.
It's so fascinating, and I'm loving this conversation, because I think for so many people, when the average typical, $25 bettor goes to war with the book, they've got all of this stuff. Like, you're walking into a bazooka fight with, a butter knife. Mm-hmm. And they have all this data, and they have all the math formulas and all the models. And it's like, it's no wonder why people have a tough time beating the books. On top of the minus 110, right? Is it you're walking into a fight that you're not really fully understanding the level of in the increment nature of how people are presenting these numbers. It's not just this team is 5 points better than that team, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what better example of that than, say, the Buccaneers and Eagles from that Thursday night affair, where the line was 6.5 and sort of, floated around 6.5 pretty much all week long. And what happens? Eagles score, they're down 8, they go for 2, which you should do when you're down 8, because then you get another touchdown.
14, but yes.
Down 14, you score. Yep. Then what do you do with point or 2-point conversion?
Right.
And the math says that's what you do. And the Eagles, they now have a second straight head coach who understands this dynamic, because they do embrace analytics out there in Philly. And so they go for 2 and convert it. The entire line was based solely upon if they would convert this 2-point try. How in the world does the average bettor know this and capitalize off of those things when you have this real specific nuance that, if you are a data collector, you have this information and you have something actionable because of that? Everything was based upon a 2-point try being down 8 after scoring a touchdown. That's incredible how many details you have to go through to get to that point. And so if you are a sharp bettor, one of the things that you're probably doing, even if you're not accounting for that specific, you're trying to find new data that maybe the books or the market are not as privy to or don't care about as much. And that's, the extra importance of finding advanced data, because the basic stuff is already available to just about anybody and everybody who's betting something. And It's always this evolutionary process. At some point, your advanced data is going to be antiquated, and then you have to find something else after that.
How do you handle when you do the work, you do the math, you come to a conclusion, you place some money down based upon that conclusion, and then you hit or lose, or you don't hit, but you lose like 3 or 4 bets in a row? How do you handle the fact that you're putting in this math, you're putting in the work, the numbers are spitting out this answer, and it's wrong 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in a row?
That's something that you have to get used to, and that's going to happen. And sometimes even those who believe in conventional wisdom, who don't even like your analytics and poo-poo it all the time, they may win 5 in a row, and that's part of reality, and you have to accept that. And sometimes there's randomness and volatility, and you have to accept those things as well, because look, receivers drop balls, fans interfere with home runs, all sorts of random things can happen that you have no control over. And the number was absolutely sharp. And maybe you thought it was a little less sharp, but ultimately you go after what you think your process is telling you. It's always important, even after wins, to always evaluate your process. And if you're not doing that, eventually it will become antiquated, because everyone else is evolving. The books evolve about as quickly as anybody. The market certainly does. So you have to constantly evaluate. And maybe you're more motivated to after several losses, but even after wins, if you know you were lucky to pull away with a victory, that should also be treated as a loss, to go in and say, okay, I got lucky here. What happened? How can I improve upon such things? And as long as you're constantly trying to evolve, then you're in a far better place than those who aren't.
Yeah, I'm with you on that point wholeheartedly. And I think it's one of the things I try talking a lot about with the Daily Juice, other things about keeping a record of what you wager, and then making a little bit of a note as to what exactly happened. So you can go back. Like I've just started to do this in the last couple of years, but trying to look at situational spots that may come up again in the future, and just try to be able to say, okay, what did I look at? What did I see? How did I analyze this matchup? What was the line at open? What was the line at close? Where did the money come in? How did the public perceive this team in this situation? Because, I mean, every game is its own unique ecosystem, and once it's gone, it's gone. But there are some things that do get repetitive, and you can go back with it. How often are you updating, for your own models? I mean, how often are you going in there and updating the way you're evaluating certain teams?
It's something where, in terms of my own models, I may not be updating them as frequently as perhaps I would like, just in large part because, okay, let's say I chose this particular, complex approach, this sort of black box method, and it's worked the best for me over time. So that, for the most part, may be just what I have, and then that's my approach, and that's fine. Other people may tend to be a little bit more Bayesian and constantly remain fluid and go, okay, well, the ELO rating is here. Now I'm going to move it down here. And, the overall process is fine. But those adjustments make it, changed by a few points. Home field advantage would be a good example of this in the NFL, where I'm not positive of this, but I think more home teams are losing than away teams or something like that. And so the home field advantage doesn't exist right now.
Well, let me give you this.
Sure.
I can give it to you right now. This is
Yeah.
Now we're taping this on Monday. Okay. So this is going into Monday Night Football. It will drop on Wednesday, right before Thursday Night Football. But in week 6 of the NFL, road favorites were 7-0 straight up, 6-1 against the spread. And through the last 3 weeks, it's 16-2 straight up and 13-5 against the spread. Right now, there is no home field advantage in the NFL.
That's amazing. It's amazing. And so now you figure that out and go, okay, well, it's clearly not 2.5 anymore. And it had been 2.5 in a long time. So why is this the case? Is it because officiating is more objective? Is it that fans are not as boisterous as they once were? I mean, is it because ticket prices are going up? And so then that makes people more reserved? I don't know. COVID, absolutely. COVID's still a thing, folks. It hadn't exactly gone away. It's still part of our lives. And I actually think there's a psychological, quick digression. I do think there is a psychological element when it comes to COVID, where I think for a while we were talking about TV ratings going down and even digital ratings going down. And my argument has been, we're not comfortable celebrating anything right now. I think we're still feeling really downtrodden by all the sadness around us, that we're not comfortable celebrating anything currently. And I don't know why we don't talk about that more, that we're still dealing with a psychological element to this, and that's going to take some time. I remember when I was in Alabama during some horrible storms, big tornado, or at least a few tornadoes ripped through the entire state. And then we had the Iron Bowl several months after between Auburn and Alabama. And it was just this eerie feeling where here's this big rivalry that brings the state together, so to speak. And you pick Alabama or Auburn, and then that's what you do all week. And it's crazy and it's wonderful. And it was the most muted celebration that I can recall covering anything. We just weren't comfortable because we still had the after effects, the PTSD, so to speak, of a really, really awful storm that impacted all of us in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's what COVID's doing for us right now. Now, how is this actionable? How do I, bring this back? Well, when you look at home field advantage, I think we're still not quite comfortable celebrating anything and being comfortable around other people and cheering and all that stuff. And so because of that, how long do you maintain that this home field advantage is 0 or perhaps even a negative number? That's hard to say, but it may be just something as simple as looking at the world around you and seeing when there's more positive stories in the national media. Maybe that's it. Maybe when boosters happen, people start to feel normal again. Once you pick up on those things, then maybe you can make a point adjustment. And I have no problem doing that. Any data can be useful here, just so long as it's utilized properly. But
yeah, I think to go on your point, though, I think a lot of it is we're still in it. Like I've talked about this with my wife a lot, about the idea that, like, depending on who you talk to or what part of the country you are in, some people believe that it's actually over. And it's like you mentioned, it's not over. And so we haven't even had the time to look back. Like going to games, there's still certain things that we're all, whether it be like going to a Raider game where everybody has to be vaccinated to go to a Raider game, or a university like LSU that initially said, yes, you must be vaccinated, and then went back on it and said, okay, no, you don't have to be vaccinated. Then I think that uncertainty and that uneasiness, I think it's back to what you're talking about, that people don't have the same type of like, I'm going for an escape. It's more or less, I'm going to feel normal. So I'm not going in there with the same type of like, I'm going to scream my head off for 3.5 hours. I'm going because I've always gone and I want to feel normal because I was locked up for 19 months or whatever it was. And I want to go back and feel how I did previously. And like, I was on my radio show today talking about this because it feels kind of funny, but last October, we didn't have all of this because it was all up in the air with college football and who was playing when and what was going to happen, where we're going to have the playoffs. And now we have like this like incredible insane amount of sports being thrust upon us in October. And it does cause me to be really thankful for all of it, but it does doesn't feel exactly normal. Like it feels like I'm still like trying to put my mind around the fact that I've got the NBA, the NHL, college football, Major League Baseball playoffs, and the NFL all going on all at once. And I'm trying to handicap and look at all these different games every night. So it's like, we've always had this, but after COVID, it feels different for whatever reason.
I remember when I started to work consistently again. You mentioned, all the jobs I have. I didn't always have that. After when COVID first hit and I had to readjust, say, like my teaching schedule for the classes I had, that was a real challenge. But I also noticed that other opportunities I had were kind of drying up and there wasn't as much for me to do. Now, I wasn't struggling financially or anything, but I noticed that I was working a good bit less. And so I was able to work on hobbies, catch up on other things. And I was happy to have that opportunity. But I also realized when I started to get used to working a lot again, that it took me a long time to not get exhausted after a couple of hours talking or coding or whatever it is, or writing. And I think for a lot of people, as they go back to work or get used to having lives again or following their favorite teams, like if you're in a market with 4 to 5 pro teams, there's a lot to keep up with and you have to pick and choose. And I think a lot of us still aren't used to that. And so because of that, either you're making choices or you're just more exhausted and you're sleeping a good bit more. That's hard. And that adjustment will take some time and you'll get there, but you have to accept the challenge, so to speak.
How, during COVID, speaking of which, How did that impact the way you were looking at numbers and the way that you were evaluating with a 60-game schedule, for instance, in baseball last year? Or, like this past weekend, Cliff Kingsbury comes down with COVID and the play caller for the Cardinals is out of the game. I mean, how have you accounted for those really unforeseen situations popping up?
What makes it difficult is sometimes these unforeseen situations don't even matter.
Right.
You look at what Arizona did without Cliff Kingsbury. I mean, they look just fine. They look better than fine. They look great. Not to besmirch Cliff Kingsbury and what he's done, but sometimes these things don't matter. When it comes to a 1 week deal. Now, after several weeks, if he's out for that long, and he won't be, but if he were, then yeah, you need to start making some adjustments right away. But sometimes these little 1 week changes don't have any effect. And it still matters, like from a media aspect, you still have to report on it. And still you want to send your best vibes to coach and make sure that nothing happens to him seriously. But from a betting perspective, these things may not matter. And it's okay to come in and say, this doesn't matter to the overall scheme of things. Not COVID related, but look at John Gruden, his departure from the Raiders. Here's an example where I sort of had the opposite reaction to everyone. I said, or not everyone, but I said this was a good thing and that the Raiders would be more inspired coming out at Denver. And this was one of the bets I got right and was very comfortable with. And I also think in the long term, it's going to be beneficial because John Gruden was a little bit antiquated in terms of his views on play action. Derek Carr can be an even better quarterback if he's faking out the defense more frequently, and he really wasn't. So now Derek Carr can really show what he's capable of once he's in a better system. There are decent weapons in Las Vegas already, and I love the direction the Raiders are going. But you also have to be mindful that when there is a narrative, you have to look at all three possibilities in various degrees. Either it really is going to hinder them, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever, or it has the opposite effect where it's actually beneficial.
Yeah, Rich Bisaccia, it's going to be an interesting long-term coach to watch because he's supposed to be this rah-rah guy. And so if the players, I mean, I'm on the over 6.5 wins for the Raiders. So when Gruden got taken out, I was like, uh-oh, because I really like the Raiders to win 7 or 9 games, between 7 and 9 games. And everyone's like, well, their schedule. And I'm like, look, they've got some really talented offensive players. And if they have a chance to outscore people, I think they're going to be in some games to be able to do so. And then obviously Gruden gets removed. And I don't know why this happened last year, but I went and took a look at it. And that coaches who got fired last year went 3-0 in the first game they coached in the wake of an interim coach stepping in. So, but that was normally bad teams firing their coach because of a bad year. This is not that case. This was a 3-2 football team firing their coach due to an off the field issue. And the Raiders are a very talented team. So I wasn't entirely convinced that was going to happen, but I did think the Raiders were going to win the game. I didn't bet it, but I thought they would be live, and it was really a show me game for me. I was like, okay, let's see if I see this right. And I did. And now I think the Raiders are going to have a lot to say about what happens in the West coming up for the rest of the year. And maybe the removal of Gruden's a good thing. Maybe they change up a little bit, but I'm actually really curious to see what happens going forward, because I think this dude they got in place, everyone loves the guy. And if they need a rally, someone to rally around, if you already love the coach, it's pretty easy to rally around the guy. The human part of sports, everyone always tells me whenever I'm talking about numbers, you lose the human side of things. You don't see the chemistry. You don't see the coach's ability to see what a player is doing and maybe go against the grain. How do you answer that as being a numbers guy? How do you handle when someone's saying the eye test still matters?
You have to understand frequency. How often do these things actually matter in the grand scheme of things? We all played some sport at some level in our lives, and obviously chemistry matters. If players don't get along at all, or the coach is, too much of a problem, whatever, then yeah, these things matter at the end of the day. But also understand that your experiences playing, t-ball or high school football, whatever it is, those are very much different dynamics than, say, college and professional football, baseball, whatever it might be, because, a lot more money is at stake. A lot more things matter to a lot of people, sponsorships, advertising, colleges, institutions, whatever it is. And there is something where you have to at least understand that, yeah, human dynamics matter a good bit, no doubt about it, but they ebb and they flow. And sometimes it's too difficult to keep up with the ebbing and flowing unless you are around these people 24/7. It's something where, let's take the NBA, for instance, because the term chemistry seems to get used there a good bit more than anywhere else. Well, chemistry comes and goes. You may get chemistry during the playoffs, make a run to a championship, and you just happen to capture it at just the right time. Was it anything anybody did? Not necessarily. Can you spot it with your eyeballs? Perhaps. But there are a lot of other teams with a lot of chemistry. I mean, let's take the NBA Finals from last year, the Suns and the Bucks. Who had better chemistry? I don't know. How do you measure those things? How can you tell with your eyeballs that, Chris Paul had just a little less chemistry with the rest of his team than, say, Giannis did? That's really difficult to measure. What I can tell you is how certain matchups played out and, what Phoenix's defenses are, where they were deficient in terms of taking on a big burly guy who can drive down or shoot from three. That stuff matters a good bit more, and it's a little bit more reliable over time.
All right, before we wrap here, this is a question that I get from a lot of people that I actually have had on this podcast before. The audience has come back and asked me different things to ask you, so I'm going to relay a question that they have had for other guests. I'm going to ask you, if you could recommend one book to somebody who is interested in this topic to get started, what would be a book that you think would be wise to read?
Moneyball was the first book that I read that really got me into this stuff in terms of looking at stats in a different way, where all of a sudden on base percentage matters a good bit more than batting average. And that to me is an easy place because it's also a narrative and you get to learn more about the romance of baseball, and all of that's fine and dandy. Another one I would recommend is Basketball on Paper by Dean Oliver. Now, it does get pretty advanced and pretty serious, but it's also a good book just to see how deep down the rabbit hole you can go and look at basketball from a different perspective. I think it matters a good bit as far as what sport you're really interested in and start there. And the good news is just about every sport has some, even soccer in terms of, Soccermatics and things like that. You have books that are all available whichever sport that you want to go down. Mathletics is another one if you want to try and get all of them, or scorecasting. Those might be the two best ones if you want, sort of a generalized view of every single sport. Mathletics is actually a book that I use a good bit as far as teaching is concerned. And yeah, the book is a little old, but at least you learn how to look at some concept and then break it down from an analytical perspective. And so you can look at basketball officiating and go, okay, how much does this really matter when it comes to a spread? Well, a good bit. If you have an officiating crew that calls a lot more fouls than another one, and teams go to the line a good bit more, well, that may be the time to take the over. Yeah, the market understands these things, but at least you have a more accurate number. And even if it's, okay, don't play this, well, that's better than losing money, isn't it?
No, absolutely. It's an absolute great point. And look, I think there is such a unique place for people like you and the Deck Prism guys with Matthew Davidow and Ed Miller, and The Logic of Sports Betting is a book that I've recommended to everyone. If you have never read that book, I recommend anyone in the audience to read that book because it's a great look at the analytics behind making lines in bookmaking, from a bookmaker's perspective. And I just think that there's so much growth potential from your side of the business, from an average gambler's perspective, to figure out exactly what goes into it. And I know people get angry. Some people, I've had fights with people about, like, I just want to sit and put $25 in a game and I don't want to have to worry about this and that and this. It's like, yeah, but then don't bet because you're not understanding the fight you're in. You're completely over your head right now. You don't even realize it, how much of a disadvantage you're at because of what they've got that you don't have, right?
If it's something where you are the type who wants to put 25 down on something and just prove that you know more about sports than everyone else, if that's your ego-driven approach, then who am I to stop you? Because at least there are enough of you to where the market is a little less sharp than perhaps it could be. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable like taking people's money because they're being that way. But at least I said it. At least they're aware of it. And if they don't want to listen to me, then that's their decision.
Absolutely, and it's even less because was like that way forever.
Yep.
And you would have the whales that would come in, and you would need the minnows, and you need the fish who are out there in order to fund this. This is different. You don't need the minnows the same way because you're up against the house. So you don't even you can tell people, hey, we're all going after the same pot of money here in a lot of ways up against the book. If you don't want to do the work, that's fine, but just understand that what you're getting into, you're going into a gunfight with, a butter knife, and have fun coming out with that. So it's where they are. And I'm still learning. I find this whole conversation so fascinating because I think it's great to find out, just how many people you're up against behind the counter and the risk managers as to what's at their disposal versus what's at our disposal and what we're doing to beat them consistently. And you kind of figure out why 57% is really, really good if you're able to do it at a 57% clip on top of the minus 110 to 100 situation.
Yeah, and it's also something where even those who bet a good bit will disagree and maybe even strongly disagree with some of my approaches. For instance, I love doing alternate spreads and alternate totals whenever possible because if I find something that's way off, then I want to maximize what I get out of that. And okay, well maybe I win my alternate spreads 35% of the time, but what does that mean in terms of actual dollars and cents? It turns out okay. If you can find those opportunities, and they're few and far between, but they do exist if you do model it properly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it's one that I think we'll just hold on to, and maybe we'll circle back with you because I think because everyone loves betting plus money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something I've thought about a lot over the last couple of months, and I'm not going to do it probably till next year, maybe, but it's one in basketball that I've kind of thought about doing because everyone loves the parlay, right? So you got to do the plus 400 parlay or the plus 300 parlay. You got to win 3 or 4 legs to do that. The alternative spread numbers sometimes will give you the plus 200, plus 250 that you're after, and it's one bet. Now, there's a better number on the board, right? But if you're able to look at that, you only have to win one bet to get over on this, and you're getting the plus money attraction that you're at. Is that one reason why you look at that, or is there a different reason why you like the alt spreads?
That's the biggest reason. That is it right there, is because I think you have fewer variables coming in that can affect one thing or the other. I mean, how many football games have we seen where offenses go out of control and you get a total of 65 or 70 or something like that? Even if you're live betting an over, you're still behind as far as your overall payout. But if there's something where you're doing your research and your modeling that suggests, hey, this could actually be a high scoring game, for these particular reasons, despite having 2 good defenses or a backup quarterback or whatever those conventional narratives might be, then yeah, go after it.
Yeah, and you got to be good too, because you can't be running with Alabama, Ole Miss, or Ole Miss, Tennessee. You can't be running in the games where everyone's expecting points, because like what we saw this past weekend, 84 wound up being the closing number, and the teams didn't even score 70 together. So you got to be off. When you do that, I think you've got to be willing to be ahead of the market and be ahead of your predicting things that aren't being talked about in the media. Yeah. If people are talking about this game's going to be incredible, do not go near that unless you want to go with the alternative under alt spread and take under 70 or something like that. That's going to give you plus 400, plus 500, whatever it might be. But I love that philosophy. I've not done that yet myself, but I think that's a really interesting way. If you love that plus money, if those parlays attract you, every time you add a leg onto that parlay, it gets more and more difficult for you to cash, and you can get it in one bet with one game if you handicap it right and look at it properly. It's really good stuff. Edward, do me a favor, give out your information. Where can people find you? Where can they watch you? Where can they follow?
Absolutely. So social media, Twitter @EdWithSports, @EdWithSports. Same thing with Instagram and Facebook. Those are the big ones I use. And as far as watching me, I'm on TVG and FanDuel, and I'll make sure to tweet out the times and locations, all that fun stuff, because we're all over the place. But I'm also on Bally Sports West, and I'm on at various times there. I do write for the Power Rank for Ed Fang, and so that comes out every Saturday morning. So go to thepowerrank.com if you're not part of the email blast that he has, every few days, a few times a week, I guess. And then NBC Sports Bet Tennis, tend to write Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so I have my articles there and I tweet out those links. And those are the best places.
I did not know you were doing a tennis article. I'm going to go check that out. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Everyone tells me I
Not this week. I had a terrible week. Wait a couple days and then start to look at it.
Edward, thank you for the time, man. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.